density and minimum lot size for vacant site subdivision. Those are the key, I think those are the key changes to highlight in terms of the council's position, having looked at the submissions and taken part in the mediation. Okay, next slide please. Nick, you might have to flick that on. Next topic is building heights, obviously another very important topic. And key things I'd like to highlight here again, and the main reason I'm doing this is that there aren't many changes in the other zones. So it really is mixed housing urban. Started off as 10 metres. There was flexibility to have a roof at a pitch of at least 15 degrees. You could achieve an additional metre, so 11 metres for a proportion of that roof pitch. After looking at the submissions, the mediation, architects involved, doing all sorts of modelling and sketches, we'll show you a slide in a second, but the council's position at the hearing was to increase that to 11 metres and allow the extra metre up to 12 metres as long as your roof pitch is at least 15 degrees for a portion of that roof. In terms of the terraced housing and apartment building zone, started off at 4 stories, which equates to 13.5 to 14.5 metres. In some mapped locations, 5 stories, which is 17.5 metres, and in a smaller number of locations, 6 stories, 20.5 metres. Council's position at the hearing was 16 metres was the base maximum height for most parts of this zone. In some cases 19.5, and in a smaller number of cases 22.5. And in terms of roof pitches, a 2 metre infringement of those height controls could be applied for on a non-notified basis and assessed in terms of whether it was genuinely trying to achieve a more attractive building or simply trying to squeeze in another floor. So the next slide just explains why the council's position was to support increasing the mixed housing urban from 10 metres to 11 metres. And I think I might hand over to Nick for this one.
Okay. So just quickly, it's a technical slide, but basically what it shows that in terms of the objective of the mixed housing urban zone to allow for 3-level buildings, the 10 metre height limit, you can see on that slide there and that slide there. To try and squeeze 3 floors into that 10 metres, you would be left with no room for a roof form, based on the on the notified version of the plan. So, and on a sloping site, the situation gets worse, where you actually can't achieve 3 levels of built form on a moderately sloping site in that under that 10 metre height limit. So the approach was to put the height limit up to 11 metres to enable you to get 3 levels of built form into that zone on either a flat site or a sloping site. That's shown on these diagrams on the right hand side there. So that you can get a 3. Yep.
Okay, next topic is height in relation to boundary. A technique that's in most of the operative plans. Most of you are familiar with it. Many members of the public are familiar with this planning technique of a height on your perimeter of your site that then goes into the centre of your site on an angle. It might be 45 degrees, it might be 60 degrees. The operative plans vary quite considerably, but the key change really is in the terraced housing apartment building zone. In fact, all of the other zones, as you'll see, no changes, a very standard 2.5 metres on the boundary and 45 degrees, or in the mixed housing urban to allow for that 3 stories, 3 metres and 45 degrees. The terrace housing apartment building zone, as notified, had a very complicated situation. It didn't use height in relation to boundary. It specified 3 metre setbacks from the boundary, 5 metre setbacks, and I think 7.5 depending on how high you were. So it was quite a complicated arrangement. We had a number of submissions saying there's a much better way of achieving it, and that is to have just go for the same as the mixed housing urban, 3 metres and 45 degrees. But as we'll see on the next slide, there was also a proposal to allow for an alternative height to boundary control through a resource consent process. And the purpose of this alternative height to boundary is to maintain the intended character of the zone, be that suburban or urban character, minimise visual dominance, provide for sunlight access and encourage outlook over the street. So there's a bit of an incentive to build to the street rather than away from the street, achieving a better urban design outcome. So really it's the mixed housing, it's the terrace and apartment zone. The other two zones didn't change in terms of this alternative height to boundary, but the terrace and apartment zone, and that's the two diagrams, the one on the far right and the one in the middle. We'll take the one in the middle. If you're within 20 metres of the street front, your building could have a, sorry Nick, you have to tell me what the dimension was before the 60 degrees. It was 6 or 8 metres?
8 metres.
8 metres and 60 degrees. This would be through a resource consent process. This isn't permitted as of right. You would have to apply to build within that envelope. And then further away from the street front, it's a more restrictive approach because it's 8 metres. Then there's a stepping in 2 metres, and then the 60 degrees applies. Architects, urban designers had a lot of input through the mediation and expert caucusing before the hearings to land a generally agreed approach to these controls. But I think the key thing is that it's not an as of right. You still may not be able to build right up to that angle if you're not dealing with some of the assessment criteria that would kick in when you apply for your resource consent.
Yep. So it's probably best shown. Oh, sorry. I'll just take you to the diagram, and then that might help explain it further. So what the purpose of the control is really to allow for 3-level terraces to be constructed at the street boundary within the terraced housing and apartment zone. So under the previous control, you had that setback control. You couldn't construct terraces close together within the THAB zone, which sort of defeated the purpose of the zone. So this control allows you to build 3-level terraces within 20 metres of the street, but then at the back of the site you're more restricted and you have to set back further because you don't have that access to daylight from the street.
Councillor Walker?
Yeah, just as a matter of interest, are there other cities overseas that have been through exercises like this height to boundary and arrived at positions that perhaps might be useful to look at? Because obviously we're making changes at this point to what we've thought about before.
Remember though that we're not making any more changes now.
I'm not suggesting any changes or whatever. I'm just asking whether or not the type of height to boundary issues and the like that we're experiencing here are, or putting forward, are already in place in other cities that could be worth looking at.
Yeah, we looked carefully at particularly the Australian examples of how they manage this built form in these higher density zones, and none of the controls seemed to be perfect for the New Zealand environment, so we took the best out of the Australian controls in particular and merged them into this control with the assistance of Graham McIndoe, who's an experienced urban designer from Wellington. So this isn't a replication of the overseas models, but it is taking parts of those overseas models and applying them to the New Zealand environment.
And in terms of the commentary around that, is that information available to us?
I think that was covered in our evidence, so I can go back and check that.
Okay. Any other questions? Let's keep going.
Okay. So next slide is on yard controls. The purpose of having yard controls, which are essentially no build areas around the perimeter of your site, is to provide for a better streetscape outcome than if you were simply able to build hard up against the front boundary. Provide some space for landscaping and softening the built form. Providing amenity for adjoining sites, so that's particularly in the relation to setting back from your side boundaries. Allowing for access for maintenance rather than building on the side boundary, and maintaining water quality and providing protection from natural hazards. So the key changes really to highlight are single house zone. Originally had a 5 metre front yard control, which is probably equivalent to the most restrictive control in most of the operative plans. Many of the operative plans had more of a 2.5 or a 3 metre control. In some cases they did have 5, and certainly in this, the heritage, or sort of the historic character areas have their own suite of controls. So this is just in areas that aren't historic character areas. This is the general situation. For the single house zone, 5 metre front yard was proposed to be reduced to 3 metres. Mixed housing suburban, the 4 metre front yard that went up for submissions was proposed to be reduced to by a metre to 3. And in the terraced housing apartment building zone, a 2.5 metre front yard was proposed to be reduced to 2.5. And I think we've got a slide next that shows you Hobsonville Point example of development that's pretty close to the front boundary but still achieves a good outcome in terms of allowing for landscaping and enough separation to give privacy in a more, obviously, more urban setting than in a more suburban situation. So that's, I'm not quite sure exactly what those setbacks are, but they're certainly...
So the image on the right is a 1.8 metre setback. So that's similar to the setback that we're encouraging in the terraced housing apartment zone. The one on the left is a shallower setback. I'm not sure what the dimension of that is, but the one on the right is 1.8 metres.
Okay, Councillor Walker?
Yeah, just on the change, and I'm looking at single house, 5 metres to 3 metres. Is there some information on how that's happened? Because I just make the observation that it makes it difficult to grow a tree, and for that matter to park a car.
So it's all covered in our evidence. There is also a 5 metre setback for garages. So if you have a garage, you have to set it back 5 metres to park your car in front of your garage. We weren't keen to encourage people to just park on their front lawns or anything like that. We're encouraging setbacks from garages. In terms of planting a tree, we looked at that and there's sufficient space. We were advised within the 3 metre setback to plant a decent tree.
A decent tree?
Yes.
And
Then you can't go
just got a question around the issue of the car, and it goes to conceivably discouraging cars. If we've got a house that doesn't have a garage, and that's something we want to encourage because it's effectively discouraging people from having a car, isn't it better to have a bit more distance so that somebody that does elect to have a car can park a car? I'm just trying to follow the logic.
It's a virtual car.
So we try to
I mean, the other thing we're balancing is encouraging the efficient use of these sites within urban areas. So a 5 metre setback on all sites in these suburban locations would limit a significant amount of development potential on these sites. So, you know, the car issue was part of the picture, but it was also about encouraging more efficient development of land. So, yeah, I take your point on the cars.
Can't change it. Okay. Mark, question?
I'm assuming you're not going to let me ask how much development potential would be limited, because that would be my question.
Yeah.
But as a general...
I just need to be clear, and it's not that I'm not allowing things. We've been very specific about the topics that we're covering at each workshop, and the issue of numbers, development potential and all the rest of it is a different discussion. A, we don't have the right people here, B, we don't have the information to hand, and C, we've got a huge amount of information to get through in one day.
No,
So
that's
it's just
fine.
not the right time to have
That will
that
be
discussion.
part of a discussion some other day, will it?
And it may well be, it's not, you know, let's remember that that's part of the modelling that was done in relationship to the, you know, the settling of the unitary plan. I'm not too sure whether we had planned on going into that, but if people want to have that discussion, we can arrange it.
For me, it's just about understanding the consequences. So I completely understand the way you've structured this, and this is about the theory and the principles, and that's important. But my questions are designed just to sort of gain further understanding about the consequences.
Yep. But I hope you understand that this is not the time
and that's
for that.
fine. And then just the follow-up, I suppose, to Wayne's question is to say that the reduction is driven by, at a principle level, the desire for more developments, or a sense that actually three is fine, and 5 was perhaps too much, or is it both?
It would primarily be, well, the starting point would be that 3 is sufficient, and then there's an added benefit of it does create more flexibility for development
Right, but the
of land,
sufficiency
which
thing was
is a
the
relevant
first one.
consideration under the
Of
RMA.
course.
But the starting point is that the 3 is appropriate to achieve a
Oh,
reasonable
trees.
setback, a good streetscape, and bear in mind that it's a minimum. Some people will choose to have a greater setback. Not everyone builds to the absolute minimum.
Sure.
I mean, it does happen, but not everyone chooses to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Got another question. Are there examples of cities overseas where they've got just a 3 metre setback that we could look at to see how many trees they've got and just what the landscape's like?
There's examples, I think, in Auckland, that there's a 3 metre yard, I can't remember the zone, but there's a number of zones in the operative plans with a 3 metre front yard requirement, and which have
Why don't
landscape
we
front
take
yards.
that discussion as a kind of a for interest thing that people might like to
I'd like to follow
research
up on
and
that.
have a look? Yep, I
Wayne
think
wants to visit.
that's good. And I think with a lot of this, you know, just a simple drive around Hobsonville Point is probably a really useful thing to do.
I think you're being cheeky.